Encouraging wildlife diversity in designed landscapes. This presentation is about 35 minutes and it's organized into three sections. In section one, I introduce why we would want to encourage a diversity of wildlife species on our property and provide some important considerations. Section two is the heart of the presentation that explains how wildlife select their habitat and use specific habitat elements. And in section three, I provide specific suggestions for how to put it all together to design a landscape that functions ecologically. Section one, getting started. Right from the beginning, it's important to recognize that there's no magic bean or one right way to design landscapes that support a diversity of wildlife. In other words, I can't just say do this and expect that whatever this is to be appropriate for your specific landscape. We must recognize that every property is different, that the landscape conditions around each property differ, and the specific wildlife that are around to respond to what we do on our land differ, depending on where our property is located. Thankfully, there are some overarching elements that influence what wildlife will use our land, and these are the things we need to consider as we plan our landscape design. These include elements on our property that we can usually influence, such as the presence or absence of plant layers and particular plant species, special habitats or habitat features, and unique microhabitats. And although we may not be able to influence them, we need to consider off property elements, such as where our property is located and the land use and what habitats occur in the neighborhood around our property, because these influence what wildlife are around us and how easy it is for them to get to our land. How successful we are at attracting and supporting wildlife on our land is determined by which of the on property elements we choose to remove, retain, or create, and how well we arrange those elements on our property, and by how well we design the features on our land to complement those on surrounding properties, and how well we design our land to enhance wildlife movement among surrounding properties. For wildlife, each property we work with is a possible field of dreams. If you build it and they can get there, they will come. So if our property includes habitat that is required or preferred by a wildlife species, and that species is able to get to our property, we should expect that that species will occur on our property during some portion of the year or during specific life stages. So, why would we want to design landscapes that can support a diversity of vertebrate and invertebrate wildlife? Well, for me, the number one reason is that wildlife diversity is an indicator of good ecological design. Wildlife diversity is simply a byproduct of an ecologically well designed landscape. So, if your landscape is lacking wildlife, your design is probably ecologically incomplete. And there are many benefits derived from a landscape that supports numerous wildlife species. Natural pest control is one. Many wildlife are voracious predators of insects and small mammals that we might consider pests around our homes and gardens. And if you're into organic gardening, managing your land to attract a diversity of natural predators is one of the best ways for controlling pests without chemicals. Similarly, if we can attract and support a diversity of pollinating insects, that not only can enhance food production in our gardens, but it can provide valuable habitat for native pollinators, many of which are declining worldwide. Also, attracting a variety of different wildlife throughout the year can add interest and aesthetic beauty to our property and provide opportunities for people to interact and connect with their landscape. All right, section two, how wildlife select their habitat. The purpose of this section is to help you recognize specific features and conditions to look for on and around the properties you are landscaping, and to help you understand why these features are important for specific wildlife species. This information allows us to better assess current landscape conditions and prioritize what we might add or remove from the landscape to attract or discourage certain wildlife species. I'll first discuss the patterns of habitat selection by birds. Birds select their primary habitats based largely on the arrangement and density of plant layers. In any given habitat, look for the presence or absence and the density of plants within 4 different layers. Beginning at the ground, we have the herb layer and ground cover layer, which includes the plants, fallen logs, stones, and leaf litter occurring within 0 to 2 feet above the ground. The shrub layer, that includes shrubs and young trees growing within 2 to 10 feet above the ground. The mid-story layer, that includes tall shrubs and small trees growing 10 to 30 feet above the ground. And at the very top, we have the canopy layer of tall trees growing 30 feet tall or taller. Each of these layers has a different group of bird species that spend the majority of their time foraging, nesting, or seeking cover in plants within that layer. Some bird species concentrate their foraging and nesting activities within the canopy and the mid-story layers. For example, scarlet tanagers, Baltimore orioles, great crested flycatchers, and pine warblers spend most of their time during the breeding season in the canopy layer. Vireos, rose-breasted grosbeaks, American redstarts, and house finches spend much of their time in the canopy and mid-story layers. Now, this doesn't mean that these birds don't ever use plants in lower layers, because they do. But these species concentrate their time in the upper plant layers, and they are unlikely to occur in habitats that lack the canopy and mid-story layer. So if you remove these layers from a habitat, you can expect to also remove these birds from that habitat. Other birds spend the majority of their time foraging and nesting within the shrub layer and or the herb and ground cover layer. These include common species such as gray catbirds, song sparrows, eastern towhees, and northern cardinals that prefer habitats that have patches of very dense shrubs. American robins, mourning doves, and chipping sparrows that focus much of their foraging efforts on the ground in short, sparse vegetation. And eastern phoebes that regularly perch on low shrubs while flycatching. So, as a general rule, we find that landscapes where all of the vegetation layers are present tend to support a greater number of birds than landscapes that are lacking one or more layers. However, if we want to support the greatest diversity of birds within a neighborhood or within a local landscape, we don't want all layers present within every habitat patch or within every yard within a neighborhood, because some birds require habitats where one or more layers are missing. Chipping sparrows, American robins, northern flickers, and mourning doves prefer to forage in areas with short grasses, and they seem to prefer to not have tall vegetation over their head while foraging on the ground. Tanagers, grosbeaks, vireos, and orioles that require a canopy and mid-story layer prefer to forage or sing along the edges of canopy gaps, where insect abundance is often high and they can project their song across an open space. So once birds drop into a habitat that has the correct plant layers, they refine their use of that habitat based on the plant species that compose the different layers. And the ability to find and capture food is probably the most important factor influencing which plant species birds are most closely associated with. Birds select specific plant species that support the greatest abundance of insects that they prefer as food. Caterpillars are an especially important food that most songbirds require for raising their young. And as a general rule, native plants tend to support a greater abundance of caterpillars than non-native plants. Some of the native plants that consistently support the greatest abundance of caterpillars include oaks, cherries, willows, and birches. Birds often focus their foraging efforts on these plant species. Fruit-producing plants are particularly valuable plants to encourage to attract and support a variety of bird species. Many birds readily incorporate fruit into their diet when it becomes available within their primary nesting habitat, and especially when they are migrating. And of course, ruby-throated hummingbirds require nectar as their primary source of energy, so they are most likely to occur in habitats that contain an abundance of flowering plants. Birds are also selecting specific plant species that provide their nests with the best concealment from predators. Maintaining a combination of deciduous and coniferous trees and shrubs provides the best variety of nesting opportunities for birds throughout the nesting season. Softwood trees and shrubs often provide birds with the best year-round cover from predators, as well as important seasonal cover from snow, rain, and wind. Even a single softwood tree within a yard can enhance the cover value of that yard for birds, and during inclement weather, that tree may be the favorite of all the birds in the neighborhood. So, what's the best way to accommodate the needs of multiple bird species within a habitat? The easiest and most efficient way is to encourage and maintain a diversity of plant species within every habitat layer. We also have many bird species that make their nests in holes or cavities in living or dead trees. Cavity trees are a unique habitat feature, and their presence or absence can directly relate to the presence or absence of certain birds on a property. Even small diameter trees can provide nesting sites for birds such as chickadees, bluebirds, and wrens. But larger diameter trees are able to accommodate larger birds. So, as a general rule, larger diameter trees have the greatest value as nesting habitat. Dead standing trees or snags, as well as dead branches on live trees, also provide important foraging sites for numerous birds. So, leaving dead and dying trees where safety isn't a concern is one of the best ways to provide foraging opportunities for many bird species. All right, so how are mammals selecting their habitat? We'll begin with the small mammals, which are important in their own right, and they are also important food sources for larger mammals, hawks, owls, and many snakes. So, habitats that support an abundance of small mammals are often habitats that support an abundance and variety of predators. Small mammals are usually responding to the presence or absence of specific microhabitats, which are small habitat patches that provide them with food, cover, and moisture. So in the landscape pictured here, we would expect small mammals to occur where there are areas of thick leaf litter that provide them with cover and that support abundant soil arthropods that are food for many species, particularly shrews. They would be found in low areas that remain cool and moist during as many months of the year as possible. They would be most abundant in habitats that contain many ground level cover objects, such as fallen logs, rotting stumps, brush piles, and rock walls. Small mammals tend to be least abundant in habitats that lack a dense shrub or herb layer, because these wildlife are particularly vulnerable to predators in habitats where this low cover is sparse. Habitat patches like the one pictured here, that are composed of dense, diverse shrub and herb cover, provide ideal habitat for most small mammals. These areas provide good overhead protection from predators. The shrubs and herbs maintain the humidity by slowing the wind and collecting condensation as dew that provides an important source of water. And here, there is a concentration of food resources, including seeds and fruits produced by the plants in the patch, invertebrates on the plants and within the leaf litter, and seeds that accumulate here when they are blown in by the wind. Similar to birds, the best way to support a diversity of small mammal species is to encourage and maintain a diversity of plant species. The tree squirrels, including gray squirrel, the flying squirrels, and red squirrels, occur primarily in habitats that have an established canopy layer of mature trees, and they require large diameter trees for denning. Having such trees in the landscape may reduce the need for squirrels to den in your home. These squirrels also prefer habitats that include mature fruit and nut producing trees, particularly oaks, hickories, beech, and cherries. Numerous bats may use the landscapes we design. All of our bats in New England are insectivores, and they forage primarily for flying insects, especially moths and beetles. Bats prefer to forage in the air over yards, wetlands, and fields where overstory trees don't clutter the airspace. During the day, most bats roost in tree cavities or under the loose bark of dead or living trees. Some species will roost in buildings and other structures around human habitation, and in my experience, it's not uncommon to find bats roosting inside the umbrellas of patio tables. The presence of medium-sized mammals is related to the location of microhabitats that provide them with abundant food and adequate denning cover. These are the wildlife that many landowners would like to discourage, and the best way to discourage them is to remove the human-created features they use from the immediate proximity of our homes. For example, many of these species readily den in human structures, such as culverts, in abandoned vehicles, or under outbuildings or decks. These species are most commonly attracted to yards where they can find easy to access food. So the best way to avoid and minimize conflicts is to remove or secure food sources such as trash, pet food, compost, and birdseed. And electronetting is often the best way to discourage porcupines from damaging fruit trees. I'll now discuss the patterns of habitat selection of amphibians and reptiles. Most frogs and salamanders occur in close proximity to the specific wetland habitats they require for breeding. Some species require wetlands that don't dry up, such as deep marshes and ponds. This includes green frogs, whose tadpoles take 1 full year to grow into frogs, and bullfrog tadpoles that require at least 2 full years to develop. These species rarely travel far from water, so to expect them on your property, you would need to have the wetland they use for breeding on or very near your land. Other amphibians prefer to lay their eggs in wetlands that periodically dry up, because these wetlands lack fish that eat young amphibians. These species live on land most of the year, often hundreds of yards away from any wetland. And while on land, they require the same type of microhabitats that are required by small mammals. The type of wetlands on and around your property also influence what turtles you can expect on your land. For example, painted turtles and snapping turtles occur in most types of wetlands, and they are usually the most likely turtles to find on your land. Blanding's turtles and spotted turtles occur in marshes or shrubby wetlands, so these types of wetlands must occur somewhere within the local landscape to expect these species. Wood turtles are associated with rivers and streams. And although uncommon, box turtles can occur in a wide variety of forested, field, and suburban habitats because they are primarily terrestrial and don't require wetlands. All of the turtles prefer to lay their eggs in dry, sandy soil, such as occurs along roadsides, driveways, and gardens, and they may nest over a half a mile from water. During the hottest portion of summer, turtles require cool microhabitats to escape the heat. These include ephemeral wetlands such as vernal pools, small water gardens, and areas with tall, dense grasses or wildflowers. The presence of frogs, salamanders, and turtles away from wetland habitats is influenced by how permeable the landscape is. In other words, are there routes that allow these species to travel safely across the landscape? Typical travel routes of these species include riparian areas of streams and other low wet drainages that provide them with moist refuges through dry uplands. Maintaining dense tree and shrub cover in these areas is the best way to maintain their value as travel corridors for amphibians and turtles. Snakes are selecting their habitats based on the location of microhabitats that provide them with cover to escape heat and predators, water that provides refuge from cold or hot temperatures. They require areas with sparse vegetation for basking, cover objects such as stones, fallen logs, and woody debris for hibernating or laying eggs, and burrows for hibernation. Snakes also spend a large portion of their time in the microhabitats where their prey are most likely to occur. Most of our largest snakes eat small mammals, bird nestlings, and bird eggs. Most snakes eat amphibians, and small snakes, including garter snakes, smooth green snakes, and ribbon snakes, eat insects. I'll finish this section with just a few words about habitat selection by arthropods. Arthropod species diversity and abundance is usually most strongly influenced by plant species composition. Most herbivorous insects require specific plant species as their food. For example, monarch caterpillars are very unlikely to occur in habitats where there is no milkweed. Although most pollinators are pretty general in regards to what species of plants they collect nectar and pollen from, many key in on plants with flowers that have a specific shape that matches the shape of their mouthparts. Parasitic wasps lay their eggs in caterpillars, and they require habitats with an abundance of nectary plants, such as dill or golden Alexander, that have numerous small, nectar-filled flowers. And most predaceous arthropods are selecting plants that support their preferred prey. Consistently, we find the greatest diversity and abundance of arthropods in habitats where all plant layers are composed of a diversity of flowering plants, especially if native plants are the dominant plants and there is a diversity of plants that bloom in succession throughout the growing season. All right, you just earned your certificate in Wildlife Habitat Selection 101. Now, in the next section, I'll provide some practical approaches for how to put these elements to work to encourage a diversity of wildlife. One of the first elements to consider are plant layers: the ground layer, the shrub layer, the mid-story layer, and the canopy layer. Remember, there are different wildlife species associated with each layer, so we want all plant layers present. But to encourage the greatest diversity of wildlife, we want these layers to occur in a patchy arrangement, with some areas or patches containing all vegetation layers, adjacent to other areas where one or more layers is missing, because we know that some wildlife prefer or require habitat patches that are missing one or more layers. Now, you don't need all layers on your property. If you have a small property, it may actually be difficult to provide all of the layers on your land. Regardless of your property size, the goal is to design your land to complement what features occur on neighboring properties. Your goal on your land is to provide layers that are absent or rare on other properties in your neighborhood. This is the best way to enhance habitat diversity in your neighborhood, and it gives wildlife a reason to use your yard. So, visit with your neighbors and/or conduct a remote assessment to see how your property currently compares with others in your neighborhood. Perhaps you find that most properties are dominated by an herb layer and a layer of short shrubs. If this is the case, you might prioritize on your property adding tall shrubs, short trees, and trees that will eventually grow tall. Pay particular attention to your property boundaries and look for opportunities to extend plant layers across boundaries. Here, the tree, mid-story, and shrub layers provide one continuous soft edge that joins these properties seamlessly. In a nutshell, what we're trying to do is widen and make our property edges more structurally complex by establishing dense plantings within all layers. This picture represents most suburban landscapes, which are dominated by mowed lawns and very narrow, sparse plantings. Here, cover and foraging opportunities for wildlife are few, and it's difficult for animals such as turtles and amphibians to move across the landscape due to a lack of vegetative cover. This scenario can be improved by widening the areas of the plantings and making them more structurally complex. This is accomplished by simply allowing vegetation to grow and/or by adding dense plantings in all vegetation layers. The goal is to convert straight bands of narrow cover into wider bands with dense peninsulas of cover. Often, the best places to create this cover is along the edges or backs of properties. Whenever possible, work collaboratively among neighbors to extend these bands of cover among adjacent lots to improve connectivity throughout the larger landscape. This approach can significantly enhance the habitat value of a property enhance privacy between lots, and it still provides people with plenty of opportunity to spend their precious free time mowing their lawn. Work to establish and maintain a diversity of plant species in every layer. This includes maintaining or establishing a combination of evergreen and deciduous trees and shrubs, fruit and seed producing plants, and a diversity of flowering plants. With this approach, our goal is to use the plant layers to provide cover and food for as many seasons as possible. For example, maintain or establish a variety of fruit-producing plants that fruit in progression across the seasons, with some plants producing fruits in early summer, some in late summer and fall, and some, such as winterberry, holly, and crabapple, that hold on to their fruits into the winter or early spring. These plants with persistent fruits are especially valuable winter food for resident wildlife and for early spring migrant birds that arrive before insects become abundant. Also, choose a variety of plants that will flower in progression from early spring through late fall. And when thinking about flowering plants, don't forget the trees and shrubs, which also provide flowers. For example, red maple provides some of the first flowers of the year, and these are especially valuable sources of nectar and pollen for insects when very few other flowers have started to bloom. When making decisions about which plants to remove or which to add to your property, pay particular attention to maintain or establish plant species that are uncommon in other areas of your neighborhood. Again, you want the habitat features on your land to complement those on neighboring properties. If you are adding plants, choose species that will fill niches not provided on neighboring properties. For example, if there are no dense conifers on your neighbor's property, adding a conifer or two can provide valuable unique cover and give wildlife a reason to visit your yard. Also, look for opportunities to group mutually beneficial plants near property edges. For example, many fruit-producing trees and shrubs require cross-pollination from other varieties, but perhaps you don't have enough space on your property to plant more than one apple tree. But if your neighbors have an apple or even a crab apple, you could plant your apple tree near the property boundary so the trees can benefit by cross-pollinating one another. If you decide to add new plants, be sure you understand what they require for growing conditions. Most fruit-producing shrubs require direct sunlight for most of the day if you want them to produce abundant fruit. Wetland-adapted plants like this elderberry are more likely to thrive and produce abundant fruit when they are planted in areas that remain moist throughout most of the year. Plants grown on the right site are less likely to get outcompeted. They'll produce more flowers and fruits, and they'll be more naturally pest resistant. Before you purchase plants, I strongly encourage you to take a year or more to carefully observe your land throughout all of the seasons to find the different microhabitats. Make a map and write notes about which areas of your land tend to stay wet. Where does the snow melt first? Which areas get the first sun of the day and which stay sunny all day? Once you know where these microhabitats are, you can be strategic and maintain a huge variety of plant species on even very small properties. I also strongly encourage people to work with existing plants that are already established before going out and buying new plants. In many cases, people have fruiting shrubs already growing on their property, but they don't recognize them because the plants are in the shade and they don't produce fruits. These plants can often be encouraged to fruit simply by removing an overtopping tree or two to give them sunlight. Using established plants has a couple of important advantages. First, it's obviously cheaper because you don't need to purchase new plants. And established plants are often growing on a site where they are best adapted, so they're easier to maintain. Established plants also tend to be far more resistant to browsing by deer. Plants just out of a nursery usually have been fertilized, and deer prefer to browse these plants because they are more nutritious and they taste better than the same plant that has been growing in less fertile native soil. Now, this might come as a surprise, but I caution you to not rush to remove invasive plants until you have assessed their current role in your landscape. In many landscapes today, removing invasives without a clear plan for how to replace them with comparable native plants will reduce habitat quality. Many of these plants provide wildlife with valuable fruit, nesting cover, cover from predators, and abundant flowers for pollinators. Some, like this autumn olive, also are nitrogen fixers, and they produce fruits that people can eat. And in areas with high deer densities, it can be almost impossible to grow native plants, which are far less deer resistant than most established invasives. Heavy deer browsing is one of the primary reasons why some of these plants become invasive. I use the prevalence of invasive plants in the surrounding landscape as one guide to help me decide whether I should remove an invasive plant from my property. If invasives are well established in the neighborhood surrounding your property, then aggressive control and removal of those same invasive plant species on your property may not be warranted or realistic. However, if your property has the only or most of a particular invasive plant species, then aggressive control of that species may be warranted to reduce the likelihood of that plant spreading from your land. Whenever we are adding new plants to our landscape, we should prioritize using native plants whenever possible and avoid adding known invasive plant species, which is actually illegal in most states. Retaining dead trees and live trees with dead limbs and cavities in areas where safety isn't a concern is one of the best ways to attract certain birds and mammals to your property. If your property lacks cavity trees, you can erect nesting or roosting boxes to add habitat opportunities to wildlife. And while we're obviously not going to leave large fallen logs and branches on our lawns, anytime we can leave or add cover objects on the ground, that is an easy way to provide habitat opportunities for wildlife. At the ground level, as a general rule, we want to always keep our soil covered with live plants and or natural mulch, such as leaf litter or wood chips. Covered soil is more likely to be healthy soil, and it is more resistant to non-native plant invasion. Live plants not only provide cover and food to wildlife, they also feed the soil with exudates that are especially valuable for supporting mycorrhizae that plants require to stay healthy, that make the plants more nutritious for people and wildlife, that protect the plants from soil pathogens, and that help plants remain more vigorous during drought and when exposed to other stressors. Healthy plants also produce higher concentrations of secondary metabolites that deter and or are toxic to pests. And this can be especially valuable for organic gardeners who don't want to use chemicals. There are a few exceptions where we may not want to cover exposed soil. For example, areas of exposed soil near wetlands are likely to function as nesting sites for turtles. So it's good to monitor these sites and leave them unvegetated where erosion isn't a concern. Also, small patches of exposed soil can enhance habitat for certain wildlife, including mourning doves that will forage in these areas for weed seeds and northern flickers that specialize on eating ants on the ground. Native solitary bees often create nests in dry, sandy soil, and areas of exposed soil that puddle can provide important minerals for butterflies that come to drink the mineral-enriched water. Finally, I strongly encourage folks to work toward eliminating all pesticides, herbicides, and synthetic fertilizers on their property. These can have far-reaching negative consequences to numerous wildlife, particularly native pollinators, and they can inhibit natural soil processes. None of these chemicals should be needed once your landscape is functioning ecologically, starting with a diversity of plants that are growing in the most appropriate sites. If you have any questions or comments or would like an electronic copy of this presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me at matt.tar@unh.edu.